Hi friends, today we're doing Unit 10, Lesson 14, The Road to Revolution, Part 1. We're going to start by going over the key vocabulary words you'll be hearing in today's reading. Our first word is influx, an arrival, invasion, flood, or entry. Our next word is outspoken, refers to someone who speaks in an honest or open way. Our next word is representation, the action of having someone do something for or on behalf of someone else or a group of people. And our last word is taxing, demanding a payment be made to the government, usually to support services provided by the government. We are now going to move into today's reading. Chapter 19, The Road to Revolution, Part 1. You have learned about how the English colonies were established and how the colonists lived their lives throughout this time. The English, Spanish, and French fought each other over land in North America. They were land hungry and clashed over the areas of North America they wanted for themselves. The Spanish had forced the French out of what is present-day Florida and gained control of it. The Spanish also moved into the areas of North America now known as New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Texas. The French were colonizing parts of present-day Canada and had also claimed the Mississippi River Valley for France. This is an image of the English, Spanish, and French soldiers. Whereas some of these land claims resulted in wars on European soil, other clashes were beginning to take place in North America. At the same time, more and more Europeans were coming to the English colonies and searching for new land to settle. They began to move further west, away from the coastal areas where people had first settled. Over time, the Native Americans began to realize that there would be no end to the influx of people. In 1675, war broke out in New England. It was time for the Wampanoag to take a stand. Chief Metacom and the son of Chief Massasoit led a war party against some English settlers. This attack turned into an all-out conflict. Eventually the English settlers won, essentially destroying the Wampanoag tribe and taking even more of their land. The caption to this says, Wampanoag approaching English settlement. As the colonies grew, English explorers continued west across the Appalachian Mountains to what is now the Ohio River Valley. However, this land was not uninhabited either. Native Americans had been living in this region for a long time, some of them having been forced to move west away from the eastern regions to escape the influx of settlers. The French had also claimed a few areas of the Ohio Valley. The French had established a good trading partnership with various native tribes in the area. They didn't want the English settlers to interfere with this business relationship. Neither the Native Americans nor the French wanted English settlers to build homes upon this land. However, members of the British Parliament wrote to the French and told them that it was a well-known fact that the land belonged to Great Britain and they should go away. The French considered this request and then replied, none. This was a bad sign. Conflict was brewing. The Native Americans, distressed by how much land they had already lost, steeled themselves for a fight, and so did the French. This is a French and Indian war battle scene. Yet another war broke out in 1754. This war is known as the French and Indian War. Fought in the forests of North America, this war went on for a very long time, almost 9 years in all. Colonists in North America were asked to fight for this land. Britain also sent thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean to fight. Many Native Americans in the region, such as the Huron, fought with the French in this war. Others, such as the Iroquois, sided with the British. 2 years later, the war over the colonial territory in North America spread to other parts of the world where France and Great Britain competed for land, such as Europe, the West Indies, and India. This phase of the war is known as the 7 Years' War in Great Britain. Eventually, after much conflict, the British captured the French-controlled city of Quebec, Canada. The capture of Quebec in 1759 was a turning point for the British, who eventually won the war. In 1763, the war was over, but this was the beginning of the end for French fortune in North America. Although the French and the British signed a peace treaty, the Native Americans did not. Organized attacks on British settlers continued under the leadership of Chief Pontiac and the Ottawa tribe. These assaults, commonly known as Pontiac's Rebellion, actually involved a vast network of at least 13 Native American tribes, which united together. The British soon realized that it would be impossible to defend this land or the settlers on it. As a result, the British Parliament and King George III decided that settlers could not live on land west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1763, King George issued a proclamation forbidding it. Can you imagine? Having just fought a war for ownership of this land, colonists were now told to stay away from it? This is an image of King George III before Parliament, the proclamation being read. Fighting a war for many years is a very expensive thing to do. When it was over, the British Parliament realized that they had spent a great deal of money. Britain was in financial trouble, and someone had to help them get out of it. That someone was the 13 colonies. The Prime Minister of Great Britain at the end of the French and Indian War was a man named George Grenville. Grenville was asked to come up with a plan to pay off Britain's debt. He thought long and hard about this and did indeed come up with a plan. How about taxing the colonists? He thought to himself. After all, Great Britain fought the war to defend the colonists against the French Native Americans. Grenville presented his plan to King George III and Parliament. Everyone in Britain agreed. It was a great plan. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law placed a tax on foreign sugar and molasses. By making foreign sugar and molasses more expensive, the colonists were being forced to buy these goods from the British producers in the West Indies. However, this act did not just include sugar, it also included wine, cloth, coffee, and silk. The colonists were now taxed if they chose to buy less expensive products from other nations. Then in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act stated that all printed materials produced in the colonies would be taxed. Newspapers, magazines, legal documents, and, believe it or not, even cards would cost more. People were required to buy a stamp and place it on the paper item they had purchased. In the same year, the Quartering Act was passed by the British Parliament. This meant the colonists had to help provide quarters or temporary places to live for the British soldiers stationed in the colonies. The colonists also had to provide supplies, such as food, bedding, candles, and firewood. For many years, the colonists had handled their own affairs. Now, members of a government 3,000 miles away had voted to tax the colonists. The colonists were not allowed to vote for these British leaders, so they felt their views and thoughts were not represented in the British government. This caption says American colonists read the Stamp Act. Many colonists believed that it was unfair that they had to pay taxes, but did not have representation in the British Parliament. The British responded that members of Parliament considered the interest of the entire empire and not simply the areas they represented. Although most people had accepted the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act, they were not prepared to accept the Stamp Act without a fight. Some outspoken colonists began to suggest that they should not pay for it. They cried, "No taxation without representation." You may now move on to Unit 10, Lesson 14, Google Form.